I believe we have a duty to act as if the truth is real. And I believe that our actions are much, much more powerful than our words. The lack of urgent action and the lack of political engagement by the scientific community is actually quite dangerous because it sends the wrong signals.
You're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matter, your host, and I've got a great guest on the program, Dr. Charlie Gardner. He is a professor at the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology. He has a PhD in conservation science, specializing in Madagascar ecosystems. He's also a member of the Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, and welcome to the program.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be with you.
So tell us a little bit, Dr. Gardner, about your journey and what brought you to the environmental movement and led you to teaching and being an activist as well.
So ever since I was a young kid, for as long as I can remember, I've only ever wanted to make a difference to the natural world. I grew up in tropical countries, in Mauritius and elsewhere, and some of my parents' friends were wildlife conservationists. So since I was really young, I was aware of the environmental crisis, and I've only ever really wanted to do something about that. My professional journey since actually has been a bit of a quest to find an effective way of doing something about this crisis. And so I've tried lots of things. For a long time, I was a conservation practitioner on the front lines, trying to save ecosystems and threatened species. I then moved into research, thinking that, if we have big complex problems, then we really need the information to be able to address those problems. I have tried teaching. I've tried communication, writing and communication, to try and bring these issues to bigger audiences. And as you say, now a big part of my focus is on political activism, because I think this is, something, it's one area in which I feel I have some power to make a difference, both as a citizen and explicitly as a scientist.
So tell us a little bit about your work in the political domain and what are the efforts that you're currently working on? What do you think has been kind of most effective at moving the needle in the political domain?
That last question is quite a tricky one. What's been effective in moving the needle? Because of course things aren't going well politically across the Western industrialized world. We're seeing backwards movement from politically from where we were on climate just a few years ago. We were getting a lot of talk in response to largely in response to climate activism a few years ago. Nowadays, governments seem to be backtracking on their promises. So in terms of what I've been doing, I threw myself into activism in response to the launch of Extinction Rebellion in 2018. I went down to some of the first big mass actions in London, and I felt that this was something that that I've been waiting for a long time. And as someone that has been aware of these crises all this time, I've always been a bit astonished that nobody seemed to be treating them with the urgency that they require. And here, when Extinction Rebellion and these strikes came about, here were people treating them with urgency. So I went along just as an ordinary citizen, and I was talking to lots of people there, and I was astonished to meet such a diversity of people, but not to meet any scientists. So I thought this was odd because it's scientists that have told us about these problems. It's scientists that have the greatest knowledge and understanding, and yet they weren't out there on the streets. So I went back home and I wrote a journal article for an academic journal saying, where are the scientists? We really need to be acting on our own warnings. And since then, I've been quite involved with trying to activate and mobilize other scientists into activism. I've written quite a lot about this in academic journals, and I take action with Scientists for Extinction Rebellion in the UK, and also a global group called Scientist Rebellion. And I believe that scientists have a particular power and responsibility to do more than just publish our research and publicize scientific warnings, because I believe we have a duty to act as if the truth is real. And I believe that our actions are much, much more powerful than our words. As social animals, we pay attention to what other people do more than what other people say. And I think the lack of urgent action and the lack of political engagement by the scientific community is actually quite dangerous, because it sends the wrong signals, I think. If I was to tell you now that I can smell smoke coming from up the stairs, and I think the house is on fire, but then I was just to continue recording this chat with you, then of course neither you nor your listeners would believe me when I say the house is on fire, because my actions just don't, they just make it seem like I don't even believe my own words. Well, I think this, to some extent, is what the scientific community is doing now. We've all sort of been brought up to believe that our role as scientists is just to provide the information and to leave the decision making, leave the policy making to others. We're just supposed to be neutral here. But I think when we say it's an emergency, and we proclaim that everything must change, but then we don't get up and do anything ourselves, I think that sends a very dangerous message. So I believe that as a scientist, I just feel a bit of a moral obligation to do more, because I don't feel that simply publishing scientific papers is an effective way to transmit the message that this really is urgent.
I think that's beautifully said, and in particular, the analogy of the house on fire just kind of brings it home in a very real way about how people perceive the information that they're getting from the source, and if the source is not behaving as if there's a fire going on, then why should I? And I definitely get that. I guess the question is, you address this, but which is the neutrality of science. And I guess in the past, generally speaking, maybe governments didn't immediately listen to scientists, but eventually they kind of made changes in accord with science. And maybe the other piece is that we've never faced an emergency like this in the past. And maybe that's also a problem for kind of just the human consciousness to really get our head around the scope of this problem.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is, there is this expectation that scientists, should be neutral. As you say, it's an emergency, and emergency times call for emergency measures, and so it makes sense to me that academics should step beyond the bounds of our social norms, because these are normal times. But the other thing also is that, as you said, there is this expectation of a relationship between governments and scientists. And there is this expectation that science eventually leads to policy that's in the public good. And as you said, it's not merely rapid enough. It certainly used to be the case, or certainly the assumption, that is the relationship between scientists and governments. Scientists have a critical role as sentinels. Our role is critical to the well-being of society. The problem is, firstly, I think that there's an issue that the pathway from science to policy has never been clear, and has never been straightforward. But more importantly than that is that over the last few decades, there have been private interests, special interests, deliberately trying to disrupt this relationship between scientists and government, deliberately trying to stop scientists from playing the vital sentinel role that we play. Of course, I'm talking about fossil fuel industry, more recently, other big damaging industries like agribusiness, aviation, motoring, construction, chemicals, plastics, all the rest of it. But on top of that, there are also neoliberal fundamentalists who are opposed to government regulation on principle. They believe in an absolutely free market where governments shouldn't interfere with environmental or social legislation. So these private interests have spent decades trying to obstruct the pathway from science to policy. And they've done that in two main ways. Firstly, by interfering directly with the political process, donations to politicians, political corporate lobbying, and the amounts of money here are just extraordinary. So the kinds of money we're talking about here are just extraordinary. Data show that in an average year, or in recent years, the fossil fuel industry has given about $250 million per year to US politicians in direct donations and another $250 million in political lobbying. So that's just one country in just 1 year and just one industry, but there's $500 million in private money there that is trying to prevent the kinds of legislation that would limit their ability to do business. The second way that these corporations and others have tried to stop effective government action on climate change is by trying to persuade the public that this isn't the urgent crisis that we say it is. And they've done that by undermining the findings of climate scientists, through massive decades-long disinformation campaign. They've also gone further and not just tried to undermine and discredit the findings of scientists, but they've tried to undermine and discredit science itself and faith in evidence-based reason and policy. And this is fantastically dangerous. So there was a recent paper that was just published last week that made this case very, very clearly. It was published by a philosopher of science. They said scientists are not able to play their vital role in society. Then surely they have an obligation to step up and defend science so that they can better play that role. And I very much feel that. I don't feel that we have a level playing field for information. Of course, I and other scientists became scientists in the first place, not because we love doing research, but because we wanted to produce information that will be useful. And if the pathways for that information to be useful are blocked by special interests, then I think we have an obligation to stand up and try and open up those pathways again.
Well, I think that's a fascinating set of questions kind of arise from that. And it's kind of they're playing defense to protect their profit centers. And how does one kind of get around that? And kind of from my Eastern philosophy, kind of a Tao Te Ching, perspective, maybe you go around the pathways that you do have. And one of the pathways that I see, of course, as a litigator is litigation. So that has had some degree of effectiveness against the industry, but it hasn't been as effective as we all would like because it tends to be slow. And there are a lot of cases wending their way through the court systems around the world, attacking fossil fuel companies for their pollution and scientists who are teaming up with them to attribute the effects of global warming to particular individual fossil fuel companies, which is kind of the bingo of litigation is causation. So scientists and litigators are connecting the dots to the pollution trail. which I think is one way to do it, and bankrupt them essentially at the end of the day, or at least persuade them through the cost of pollution, getting the true cost of pollution borne by the polluters. Now, there's multi-pronged front, but one thing I'd like you to comment on that, but also one other thing, which is you mentioned Extinction Rebellion and other youth-led movements back in 2018 really having some energy, and it seems as though those kind of high energy protests haven't really been landing in recent years. What can one do to kind of, you know, get that fire going again? I guess it's a tough question because obviously, if we knew, we'd do it maybe. But what do you see as kind of the missing ingredients behind that effective mass movement?
I think you're spot on. Unfortunately, a lot of the energy that was built in that time has dissipated. I think initially that happened because of COVID-19 and lockdowns, which sort of took the wind out of our sails a little bit. More recently, I I think a big factor has been legal crackdowns. So countries around the world have been implementing legislation to to limit the right to peaceful protest. Incidentally, often this legislation looks very similar in different countries around the world, and that's because it is part of a concerted effort. It is in the UK, for example, the legislation was drafted by a think tank called Policy Exchange, and Policy Exchange receive fossil fuel money, and they are part of the global Atlas network of fossil fuel funded right wing think tanks. And it's these fossil fuel funded think tanks that are drafting legislation against activists that is being enacted around the world. So this is yet another prong on the multi-pronged attack by the fossil fuel industries. So yes, I think that the energy in mass protest movements, social movements has dissipated. What we see in the UK is that the energy hasn't so much disappeared as dispersed. What I think really happened with the Extinction Rebellion is that it brought together and empowered vast numbers of people. But many of those people have subsequently gone on to then found other smaller things addressing one small aspect of the overall problem. So I think there's been a splitting from large groups into smaller groups that I don't think that's necessarily problematic, because it means a lot more is going on. And I think it highlights, to me, there's an important lesson there for me, and I hope for many of our listeners as well, which is that you ask what we need to be doing. You and I have very different approaches. Your approach is through legislation and mass communication through your podcast. My approach is through academic work and activism on the streets. And this highlights just what a huge diversity of work is needed. And really, there is no limit to the kinds of work we need to be doing. So I think what's happened in the UK is that, as I said, Extinction Rebellion helped its members feel the agency that they have as individual agents of change, and have gone on to go and do lots of wonderful things in all sorts of domains. At the same time, we've not been very successful in continuing to recruit more members after that initial wave in sort of 2019, 2020. I think in large part partly because of the threat of legal crackdown, partly also because of media demonization. We have been very much demonized across the media. We have been othered. The message is, these people aren't respectable. These people aren't like you. Don't listen to them. Don't join them. And so it's left us in a situation now where we think there are huge numbers of of people that are really concerned and really want to do more. They really want to take action in their own lives. But the only options that we're really given are either you could work on your own personal carbon and environmental footprint. And, 95% of all guidance available, it's not hard to find a blog or a magazine article listing 10 things you could do for the climate, but 95% of them are all about your own personal carbon footprint. And I think people can see through that. It doesn't. I think for a lot of reasons, people don't think that's adequate. I think people do want to address their footprints, but it's not enough. It feels wrong that the responsibility is down to me to change my shopping habits when the fossil fuel companies are just doing whatever they want. And it just feels so completely insufficient. On one hand, you're telling me this is an emergency and everything needs to change. On the other hand, you're telling me that the only contribution I can make is to take the bus. It just doesn't make sense. And yet this is the only guidance that's available to us. The only other thing we can see is that when people turn on the news in the evening, they can see people getting arrested on the streets. And for whatever reason, that doesn't appeal to them either. Either for whatever reason you can't afford to get arrested, or there are identity-based issues there too. I don't see myself as an environmentalist. I'm not a hippie. I'm not a tree hugger. That's not my thing. So there's this. I think there's the broader climate movement hasn't been really successful enough up till now in making a home for everybody, for making a home for the 80% of our populations, or whatever, 70% that actually want to do more, because the options we've presented are either insufficient or too much.
Well, I think that it's an interesting point, a number of interesting points you make about the atomization kind of the movement. And I guess in part that may make the movement stronger because it is dispersed, and it's harder to stamp out a movement that has 1,000 nodes to it or 1,000,000 nodes to it versus that has one node. So that it makes it hard for an authoritarian government to stop all of it. It also, I think, as you said, kind of includes more people in the process, which probably is helpful, because the sense of, I know my personal sense, being involved in an organization that has tens of thousands of people in it, I feel like, hey, am I really making a difference here? Versus a much smaller organization, I may feel like, oh, I'm part of something in which my voice actually gets listened to a bit more. So I can see that there's value in that. And one of the things for me doing the podcast for now the last 4+ years is seeing just the breadth of the movement across the world, and seeing how many, really millions of people, probably tens of millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions of people who are involved in this work in some way, shape, or form. Well, let's pivot a little bit to your work in Madagascar, and how did you get involved in that work, and what has that work entailed?
I spent 10 years living in Madagascar, mainly helping conservation NGOs, so charitable organizations, who are working with rural communities to develop more sustainable ways of managing natural resources. And we were doing that through establishing protected areas, so establishing parks and reserves, but that were co-managed by conservationists and local communities. Madagascar is a very interesting place because it's one of the world's top conservation priorities. It's an island, so all the species that live there are unique to that island. They're endemic. They don't exist anywhere else. So if they go extinct in Madagascar, they're extinct globally, and that makes it a big priority. It's also the world's poorest country, and that means it doesn't have the capacity or the resources to conserve biodiversity itself. So essentially, government of Madagascar in the early 2000s declared that they wanted to conserve its biodiversity and create more parks and reserves. But in recognizing it didn't have the capacity to do it itself, it invited foreign organizations in to do so. So I worked with WWF and a marine conservation organization called Blue Ventures. And we were, working with rural communities to establish more sustainable ways of managing forests and fisheries. It's very different to the work I do now, which is on climate change more than on the biodiversity crisis. But it's rural people in Madagascar that I do my work as a climate activist for just as much as I do it for myself or anyone else. In fact, it's the communities I used to work with in Madagascar and the species I was trying to conserve in Madagascar who are very much on the front lines of climate impacts now and already suffering them much more than we do here in the UK. So yeah, very, very different ends of what ultimately is the same problem.
Well, kudos to you and the work that you've done there. I was curious if you knew a guy named Matt Hill, who was from the University of Minnesota, who had started, I think, a movement, Green Madagascar, and they started nurseries there to protect, I think, say 80 different tree species that, we use that nursery to spread them around the country there.
I've been in touch with Matt, I believe, by email. I left the country before his work started, but I believe we've been in touch, yes.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's well, that's yet another point of connection of the amazing people that just have contributed to the environmental movement across the planet. And Matt, I guess, was inspired by his professor back in Minnesota and just decided to go to Madagascar and make a difference. So I think so many people are doing similar things to that, and I think that's the opportunity for you as an educator, is getting your students to get to take the torch and go out there. Maybe you could give us some examples of your students who've gone out there and done great things.
So yeah, I have students working, or former students working, all over the world in a range of different capacities. Some have remained as researchers, others have gone on to focus on conservation practice, actually, carrying out projects on the ground rather than just collecting information about the crisis. Others have left to work in policy. Some now use the arts to publicize the environmental crisis. There's a huge variety of things they're doing, and of course, there's a huge variety of things that needs doing. And I find that idea very uplifting too, because it means there really is a role for everyone. Yes, we do need conservation scientists going out to Madagascar and going out to other countries to help build capacity there and to do things in the world's biodiverse places. But there's not a spot on this earth that won't be impacted by climate change. There's not a community that doesn't have to transform. And I think this is the big challenge for all of us now, to turn the climate story from one where it's a challenge for experts and everyone else's role is just to sit back and wait for it to be fixed. We need to change that to a story where every single person is doing what they can in their world and feeling part of the beautiful new world we're building together.
Well said. I guess I would kind of say it's a part of self-actualization now, and that to really be an actualized person, one has to be really involved in some way, shape, or form in protecting our climate from a stewardship perspective. Hey, what are we passing on to the next generation? How are we protecting what we were given? And that is a question worth asking every single day. And that answer may change from day to day, though every single day for us to do something in this regard, move the ball some distance, and it will help us. I mean, I guess that's the message, is that I feel better when I've done something positive to affect this problem. So it's not just for society, it is also a personal problem too, because when we face an existential threat of humanity, how are we going to feel 10 years, 50 years down the road, whatever it is, when, if we said we didn't do anything? Where were you? And kind of going back to the Henry V speech, people who weren't on the battlefield, who didn't contribute that day, will look back at their lives differently than those who were engaged in the struggle.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think this is something that really worries me. I think, yeah, as a society, we have a mental health crisis now, but it will be dwarfed by the mental health crisis we have in future when people do look back and realize they had an opportunity that they chose not to take. I think, but it's not just a future issue. So psychologists looking at mental health, like climate anxiety and related things in young people, find that whilst a part of the reason why they feel so terrible is because of fear of what's coming, another big constituent of that is a feeling of helplessness. It's a lack of agency. It's that I don't feel there's anything I can do to contribute. And, Joan Baez was right when she said action is the antidote to despair. It's by becoming involved in something, particularly collective action, you start to change it from being a big unresolvable problem that's happening somewhere out there to being something that you're starting to manage and do something about. And even though the steps you take might be tiny, psychologically, the fact that you are taking some steps can help give you back some sense of control. And that sense of agency is hugely, hugely important in just helping keep despair at bay. So it is, you're right, I couldn't agree more. This isn't an altruistic thing that I do for society, or for other species. It makes me feel better too.
And also, kind of dovetailing on that, it creates the community that everybody is saying we have less of than is good for mental health, as well as for many, many other reasons. There's a lack of kind of human connection these days with our internet world, and just creating more actual contact with our community members and sense of connection improves, I know, my own mental health, and I assume, from what I read, everybody else's. So yet another reason for everybody to get engaged.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, it's not just connections with so all social connections are good always, but this isn't just connections with any old person. This is making social connections with the best, most engaged, most interesting, and most aware people. And importantly, it's making connections with people that feel like you, making connections with people that share your fears and share your concerns. And this is a big constituent of the mental health impacts that many of us suffer too, is that we feel that we're suffering them alone because nobody ever talks about this. So, and sometimes you can feel like we're the strange one for paying attention to all this stuff when everyone else is just carrying on their days, just apparent seeming to ignore it all. And being with people that take this as seriously as you are, honestly, it's just good to not feel alone. It really is.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the program, Dr. Charlie Gardner. Tell us all where people can find you on social media or out there in the internet, and support the causes that you're working on.
Thanks, Matt. It's been brilliant to chat to you. So I'm on Blue Sky and LinkedIn as Charlie J. Gardner. If you are an academic then I would encourage you to get in touch with an academic activist group. If you're in the UK, that's Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, or globally Scientist Rebellion. In the US, it's Scientist Rebellion Turtle Island is the name of the group. Do find me, do get in touch. And if you'd like to talk about getting your own personal route into activism, I'd be delighted to have a chat with you.
Well, thank you again, and great talking with you, and hope to stay connected and continue this work together, because certainly we're more powerful as a group than we are individually.
Absolutely. Thanks for everything you do, Matt. More power to you.
To learn more about our work at A Climate Change and how you can help us reach our goal of planting 30,000 trees in the Amazon this year, visit aclimatechange.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. See you next time.